What's up, everyone? Thank you for joining me today. I'm Justin Burkholtz, and it's time for another book review. This week, I am reviewing the absolutely phenomenal book that has quickly made its way to my favorites of all time. This is Karen Armstrong's incredible book, The Great Transformation, The Beginning of Our Religious Traditions. So just finished this yesterday, and going back through it to make this video, I was just even more impressed by how much information is in the book. It was very difficult to put together a tight review. The book is long, around 500 pages, which is not unusual for me. I've reviewed quite a few books that are of that length, but this one was just absolutely jam-packed with just brilliant insights and interesting historical information. So I did my best to narrow it down to some common themes and some good examples of that to share with you all. If you are interested in history, religious studies, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, history of religion, any of that kind of stuff, you are going to love this book, so stick around for the review. So, The Great Transformation focuses on a time period that scholars call the Axial Age. And the Axial Age itself is the time period from about 900 BC to about 200 BC. However, the book, The Great Transformation, actually covers a broader time period in that to give us some context to these religious traditions and how they were actually different from the traditions that came before them, and how they developed and even sometimes radically revolutionized the previous religious kind of expressions and beliefs. And so the book actually starts in around 1600 BC, so about 700 years before the actual axial age begins, to give us some of that context. And it focuses on four civilizations. So it focuses on Confucianism and Daoism in China, Hinduism and Buddhism in India, monotheism in Israel, and philosophical rationalism in Greece. Some of the main characters we're going to be discussing from this time period are known as the axial sages. Those sages include people like Buddha, Socrates, Confucius, Jeremiah, the mystics of the Upanishads, Mencius, and Euripides, and many more. I learned a lot about particularly ancient Chinese philosophy and the sages, who wrote and created those philosophies, people like Zhuangzi and Mozi and Lao Tzu. And we're going to talk about some of the major themes of the axial age, the axial sages, and the philosophies that they created, and how those were expressed, and even how they have formed the great religious traditions that we know today, so many thousands of years later. One of the really interesting points of the book is that all of these founders of these religious traditions were not concerned with what people believed. They weren't concerned with metaphysics or doctrine at all. They pretty much were entirely concerned with how people behaved and how people treated each other. And the essence of their message universally was compassion. And compassion for everyone, all humans, not just your friends, not just your family, not just people in your tribe or from your nation or empire or whatever it was, but all of humanity. This was the most important point of the axial age. And so we will come back to that regularly. One of the things that every axial sage taught was a version of what we call the golden rule. do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Don't do things to people that you don't want them to do to you. Very basic rule of living compassionately, but they essentially, all came to this conclusion separately and independently, and showed that it could work. It could change the world. This was a new concept at the time. We were coming out of a long period of tribalism and extensive warfare, hatred of the other, distrust of the other. But the Axial Age was a time when urbanization was starting. People from different regions were intermingling with each other. We had the whole Hellenistic world of Greece where there was intermingling of all these different cultures. And so people were trying to develop a way to live together with people who are different than themselves without constant strife and warfare and violence. Something that I think we can really relate to today. Like I stated, the actual sages were focused on action and behavior rather than doctrines, theology, and beliefs. According to Karen Armstrong, what mattered was not what you believed, but how you behaved. Religion was about doing things that changed you at a profound level. The only way that you could encounter what they called God, Nirvana, Brahman, or the Way was to live a compassionate life. Indeed, religion was compassion. She further states, regardless of their theological beliefs, which she shows in the book did not much concern the sages, they all concluded that if people made a disciplined effort to re-educate themselves, they would experience an enhancement of their humanity. In one way or another, their programs were designed to eradicate the egotism that is largely responsible for our violence and promoted the empathic spirituality of the Golden Rule, like I stated. This, they found, introduced people to a different dimension of human experience. It gave them ecstasis, a term we're going to come back to, a stepping out from their habitual self-bound consciousness that enabled them to apprehend a reality that they called God, Nirvana, Brahman, Atman, or the Way. It was not a question of discovering your belief in God and then living a compassionate life. The practice of disciplined sympathy would itself yield intimations of transcendence. Indeed, this compassion was absolutely central to all of the axial sages and all of the traditions that they started. As I stated before, this compassion was supposed to be absolutely universal. It says here, according to Karen Armstrong again, quote, the axial sages realized that you could not confine your benevolence to your own people. Your concern must somehow extend to the entire world. Everybody must feel towards all others exactly what he felt for his own people. As one of the Chinese sages stated, quote, others must be regarded like the self. This love must be, quote, all-embracing and exclude nobody. One of the Chinese axial sages by the name of Mo-Zi promoted a philosophy known as Zhan-I. And this is often translated as universal love. But according to Karen, this is too emotive for Mo-Zi's utilitarian ethos. She states that Mo-Zi did not expect the Chinese to develop a warm affection and tenderness for everybody. He was more interested in justice than feelings. Zhan-I was a deliberately cultivated attitude of benevolence so that you wished everybody well, even and perhaps especially those who did not belong to your immediate community. Zhan-I was based on a strong sense of equity, fairness, and an impartial concern for all human beings without exception. Mo-Zi further argued that if people did not cultivate benevolence towards the whole human race, family love and patriotism would degenerate into collective egotism. In his view, the Confucian family was simply a special interest group. Even criminals loved their families and robbed other people in order to enrich their kinsfolk. That's a very interesting line, and it's a quote from Mozi, and it reminds me of a passage from the Bible. And this actually is quoted in the last chapter of the book as well, just reiterating this how this axial age philosophy found its way into the beginning of Christianity. You might know what passage I'm talking about here when Jesus states, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." He goes on to state, "If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Once again, Jesus is agreeing with the axial philosophers and saying you can't limit your love and compassion to just people like you, your friends, your family. You have to extend that to everyone. Otherwise, it's no good at all. You're no better than anyone else. A good thing to remember here is that these axial sages and philosophers were not, living in some idealized time of peace and comfort. They were living through absolute chaos and destruction and violence, warring tribal periods where there were horrific massacres happening all the time, people being killed just for proposing new ideas, or less, just for being in the wrong tribe. And so they were reacting against the violence and chaos of their time. But not everyone reacts to violence and chaos in the same way, and Karen reminds us of this throughout the book. She says some people reacted to this with this message of compassion and nonviolence, but others turned to what we would call religious fundamentalism and militant piety. And the same thing is happening today. She says here, quote, "When the axial age began, philosophers, prophets, and mystics all tried to counter the cruelty and aggression of their time by promoting a spirituality based on nonviolence. But Zoroaster's traumatized vision, with its imagery of burning, terror, and extermination, was vengeful. His career reminds us that political turbulence, atrocity, and suffering do not infallibly produce an axial-style faith, but can inspire a militant piety that polarizes complex reality into oversimplified categories of good and evil." She goes on to state, "All the world's religions have seen the eruption of this type of militant piety. As a result, some people have concluded either that religion itself is inescapably violent, or that violence and intolerance are endemic to a particular tradition. But the story of the axial age shows that in fact the opposite is the case. Every single one of these faiths began in principled and visceral recoil from the unprecedented violence of their time. The axial sages put the abandonment of selfishness and the spirituality of compassion at the top of their agenda. For them, religion was the golden rule. They concentrated on what people were supposed to transcend from: their greed, egotism, hatred, and violence. What they were going to transcend to, well, was not as easily defined. It wasn't a defined place or person, but a state of beatitude that was inconceivable to the unenlightened person who was still trapped in the toils of the ego principle. I think the axial sages would be appalled at what we think of as religion today. Most people today, religion is just this set of beliefs, these propositions, these statements that we have to profess our belief in. And religion doesn't ask us to do anything more than that. That's as far away from the vision of the axial age as anything could possibly be. We've already talked about how They focused on action and compassion. Indeed, religion was compassion to them. Religion was the golden rule. That's it. When one of the sages was asked to teach the essence of religion, Rabbi Hillel, I believe, from Talmudic lore, there's this story where someone asks him if he could explain the Torah in one sentence that he would convert. And he says essentially the golden rule. And that's it. And he says everything else is just, speculation and extrapolation from there. And this was the defining, ethos of the axial age. To them, beliefs and metaphysics and doctrines just weren't even really worth talking about. I mean, it was a distraction from what really mattered, which is how people behave towards each other. And so they would also be appalled at our desire for quick answers and fast shortcuts to enlightenment. The whole self-help guru culture that has exploded in the last 100 years, especially here in America, is the exact opposite of what the axial sages taught. They taught that this transformation of character had to come through long, disciplined action, not just hearing some emotional message from some, prophetic preacher or something like that. It wasn't about this emotional uplifting or belief or just hearing some words. Salvation through only faith would be anathema to what they taught. What they taught was that you had to take long, disciplined action before even trying to consider those deeper questions. It's for this very reason that when people today read the Vedas or the other texts from the axial age, teachings of the Buddha, etc., they most often completely misunderstand them. And this would have been completely normal to the people teaching it 2,000 plus years ago. They would have said, of course you don't understand. You haven't done the work. The ancient mystics who wrote the Upanishads in India, they didn't proceed from logic or sense perception. That's not how people, came in contact with divinity. That's not how they experienced self-transcendence. It was only after, quote, a long period of training, meditation, and cultivating a habit of inwardness that their way of looking at the world and themselves could be transformed. Karen states very clearly that a reader who has not adopted that method will absolutely not be able to comprehend its conclusions. And I have seen this time after time myself. If you try to talk to people about Vedanta or yoga or something like that, most people here in the West can't even begin to comprehend it. They misunderstand you from the very beginning because they don't get the point that you actually have to do something. You actually have to sit. You have to meditate. In fact, the ancient yogins didn't even allow someone to sit and meditate until they had mastered the ethics of yoga. The ethic of ahimsa was absolutely paramount, which means harmlessness or nonviolence. You had to master all of the ethics before you would even be allowed to learn the postures or the breathing techniques or the deeper meditative techniques. I think we really need to go back to that way of pursuing self-transformation. Again, the Indian sages weren't the only ones. The yogis, the yogins, they weren't the only ones talking about how you needed long, sustained discipline effort. According to Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, such self-emptying required a long mystical training. But once the sage ruler had achieved this interior void, also known as kenosis, which we'll talk about later, he would become as vital, fluid, and fecund as the so-called weaker things of life. Because according to Lao Tzu, force and coercion never give you what you desire. They always recoil against you and result in force and coercion and rebellion against you. Now, I'd like to return to a couple of Greek terms that I've mentioned, and I also pointed out that we would come back to them. So the first one of those terms was a word called ecstasis. Now, ecstasis is a Greek word that means standing outside of oneself or a removal to elsewhere. It's often associated with the philosophical concept of ecstasy, okay? Not just like, a drug state or something like that, but a state of being beyond one's normal state of consciousness, sometimes described as a trance or a feeling of being transported. In religious context, it often refers to a mystical experience of union or communion with the divine or a deity. Ecstasis, while a Greek word, was described and talked about by all of the axial sages, whether it was in China, India, Israel, or in Greece. This is a extremely important point, and it's one that even modern philosophers are talking about and trying to point us back towards as something we need to reclaim and recapture. So I want to talk a little bit more about ecstasis, including some quotations from the axial sages about it. The Indian sage Yajnavalkya described ecstasis in this way, and this is how he talked about it. He says that the knowledge of the self was an experience of pure bliss and ecstasis. This knowledge lay beyond concepts and did not depend upon logical deduction. It was rather an awareness of an inner light within the heart, a direct and immediate intuition beyond any ordinary joy. This knowledge transformed the individual. It could be only attained after a long training in inwardness, in which the aspirants could achieve by practicing Yajnavalkya's dialectical method, which was systematically dismantling normal habits of thought and cultivating an inner awareness of the interior world, their dreams and subconscious states, and by constantly reminding themselves that the knowledge they sought was beyond words and of an entirely different order from their secular thoughts and experiences. The sage could not impart this knowledge as if it were ordinary factual information. He could only teach the method that enabled his disciples to arrive at that state. So this harkens back to what I was talking about before, where there was this focus on personal effort and action versus imparted knowledge, passed down knowledge or belief from a guru to another. It wasn't about the words, it wasn't about the knowledge, it was about the practices and the cultivation of certain attitudes. Karen goes on to clarify here that if someone cultivates an attitude like living by the golden rule, if that becomes habitual, people could live in a state of constant ecstasis, not because they were caught up in an exotic trance, but because they would be living beyond the confines of egotism. Which brings us to our next topic here, and another Greek word you might not be familiar with, and that word is kenosis. And this is kind of an anti-egotism. Now, kenosis, like I said, is a Greek word which means to empty out or the act of emptying. And the most famous reference to kenosis is actually a passage from the Bible in Philippians 2:7, where Jesus made himself nothing or emptied himself. And it's usually understood to mean that Jesus emptied himself of his own personal desires, becoming entirely receptive to God's divine will. And this is a concept that has carried through all of Christianity. This sort of giving up of your personal desires, emptying of yourself in order to be filled with something bigger and broader and more expansive. But the ancient Israelites and the early Christians weren't the only ones who talked about this. The ancient Chinese sages talked about this as well. In fact, Confucius did very specifically. In According to Confucius, the old rituals that existed before him had been used for political advantage or simply to enhance a nobleman's personal prestige. But he systematically took this egotism out of it. His prolonged study of the rites had taught him that they made sense only if sincerely performed in a spirit of yielding. Sons had to yield to their fathers, warriors to their enemies, and kings to their retainers. The rites taught them to give up their personal preferences, dethroning themselves from the center of their world and putting another person there. In political life, the rights had made it difficult for statesmen to promote purely self-interested policies. They had taught a disciplined habit of empathy. If performed in the right spirit, therefore, the rites were a spiritual education that helped people get beyond the limits of egotism. A reformed ritualism which cut out the old obsession with status and preeminence could make the whole of China a humane place by restoring dignity and grace to human intercourse. Another Chinese philosopher by the name of Zhuangzi believed that the sage, the enlightened being, was essentially unselfish. Quote, "The perfect man has no self. He regards other people as I. People cry, so he cries. He considers everything as his own being," he stated. Because he had lost all sense of himself as separate and particular, his heart had become empty and simply reflected other beings in their integrity like a mirror without the distorting lens of ego. So we've seen that there were some common themes across the axial civilizations that we've already discussed, from focusing on action over doctrine, the focus on universal compassion or the golden rule, and not just applying that to people like you or people that you like, but especially to your enemies. We've seen the focus on ecstasis and kenosis, the anti-egotism of the axial age, the focus on what's good for others rather than on what's good for myself. But there are two lessons that Karen states at the end of the book that we should take from the axial sages and philosophers. And so I want to end with those lessons here. So I'm going to quote a section from the last chapter of the book called The Way Forward. And this talks about how the axial age was brought forward into, the not modern time, but into the first centuries, and then eventually to our time, today. So she states here that the axial sages give us two important pieces of advice. First, there must be self-criticism. Instead of simply lambasting the other side, people must examine their own behavior. The Jewish prophets gave a particularly strong lead here. At a time when Israel and Judah were threatened by imperial powers, Amos, Hosea, and Jeremiah all told them to scrutinize their own conduct. Instead of encouraging a dangerous righteousness, they wanted to puncture the national ego. To imagine that God is reflexively on your side and opposed to your enemies was not a mature religious attitude. Amos saw Yahweh, the divine warrior, using Assyria as his instrument to punish the kingdom of Israel for its systemic injustice and social irresponsibility. After his deportation to Babylon, when the exiles had been victims of massive state aggression, Ezekiel insisted that the people of Judah look into their own violent behavior. And Jesus would later tell his followers not to condemn the splinter in their neighbor's eye while ignoring the beam in their own. I think this is an incredibly important lesson. I mean, if this isn't a direct critique of our current politics and state of being, especially here in the United States, I don't know what is. And the second lesson of the Axial Sages is no less important. She states that we should follow the example of the Axial Sages and take practical, effective action. When they confronted aggression in their own traditions, they did not pretend that it was not there, but worked vigorously to change their religion, rewriting and reorganizing their rituals and scriptures in order to eliminate the violence that had accumulated over the years. Today, extremists have distorted the axial traditions by accentuating the belligerent elements that have evolved over the centuries at the expense of those that speak of compassion and respect for the sacred rights of others. In order to reclaim their faith, their co-religionists should embark on a program of disciplined and creative study, discussion, reflection, and action. Instead of sweeping uncomfortable scriptures and historical disasters under the carpet in order to preserve the integrity of the institution, scholars, clerics, and laity should study difficult tests, ask searching questions, and analyze past failings. At the same time, we should all strive to recover the compassionate vision and find a way of expressing it in an innovative, inspiring way, just as the Axial Sages did. I would add to this that today, not only are people distorting the axial traditions, the Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, everything that came out of those traditions by accentuating the belligerent elements as she described, I would say even within American government, we have our government right now trying to sweep uncomfortable truths and history under the rug and pretending like it never happened. It doesn't work. That's not a good approach. Traumatized people aren't going to forget that their relatives and ancestors were traumatized and persecuted. It doesn't happen. We need to confront our past, not sweep it under the rug. We need to take disciplined action to transform ourselves. We need to criticize and look at our own behavior, especially the United States. We need to embrace the axial philosophy. We need to ask difficult questions. We need to look into the most problematic texts and maybe rewrite some things, maybe reorganize some things. Maybe some revolutions need to happen within our institutions rather than just protecting their integrity. Maybe their integrity was lost a long time ago when they focused on other things other than living compassionately, other than the golden rule. So that was my takeaway from this book. It quickly became one of my top favorites of all time. I'm going to recommend it to everyone forever, especially if you're an American or if you're interested in history, philosophy, religious studies, how these things actually impact world history, how they can change the course of entire civilizations. I just think it was an incredibly important book. And even though this was written years ago, it seems to address all of the major concerns I have in my country, in the United States today. So I strongly encourage you to pick up a copy of the book and read it for yourself. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that review. If you like the video, if you like book reviews, if you're interested in history, philosophy, religious studies, or spirituality, make sure to like, share, comment, subscribe. All that stuff helps me out more than anything else. If you want to support me, if you want to hear about more cool books on these topics, please help me out and at least hit the like button or subscribe. And that way my videos will be seen by more people and I'll be able to, continue doing this. So please help me out by doing that for me real fast. I have tons of book reviews on the channel already. So if you liked this review, go to my channel, check out the book reviews playlist there. There are quite a few there for you to go through that are mostly about, similar topics as this one. by a variety of authors, a variety of perspectives, and I give my take on the books. I try to elaborate on their major themes, give you some quotations like I did in this video. If you appreciate that, check out my channel, check out the other book reviews, and I'll see you soon with another review.